Okay, right. So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on our fifth Neurophilosophy of Free Will seminar, and the last one for this year. Can just say that I'm sincerely looking forward to this joint seminar by Rosa Tsao and Gabriel Kreiman, and I'll just let Nadav Amir, our moderator, take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Uri, and hello, everyone. So my name is Nadav. I'm a postdoc in Liad Mudrik's lab at Tel Aviv University and in the Brain Institute at Chapman University. Today's talk will discuss the role of operational and falsifiable definitions in stimulating the dialogue in the neurophilosophy of free will. I hope that this important methodological discussion could help establish common ground between the two cultures of neuroscience and philosophy. So before introducing the speakers, I'll just say a few words about the logistics. So we will start with two 30-minute talks, two speakers, Gabriel and then Rosa, and afterwards open the stage for discussion and Q&A for another 30 minutes. If you have any questions during the talks, you can type them in the Q&A section of the chat window below, or raise your hand if you prefer to ask a question directly. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Gabriel Kreiman and Rosa Tsao. Gabriel is a professor at Harvard Medical School and faculty at Boston Children's Hospital and the Center for Brain Science at Harvard University. He's also associate director and thrust leader at the Harvard-MIT Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines. He did his undergraduate degree at the University of Buenos Aires, his PhD at Caltech with Christoph Koch, and a postdoc at MIT with Tommaso Poggio. Rosa is an assistant professor at Stanford. She did her undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago and then went on to do two PhDs. First in systems neuroscience at MIT with Christopher Moore, and then in philosophy at New York University with Ned Block. She also did a postdoc with Daniel Dennett at the Tufts Center for Cognitive Studies, followed by a National Science Foundation Fellowship with Sean Kelly at Harvard. I'm looking forward to the talks and the discussion. So without further ado, over to you, Gabriel.
Excellent, thank you very much. So let me see, I'll share my screen here. Can people see the screen? Yes, excellent. So thanks a lot for organizing this and for the introduction, Nadav. I really look forward to this being more of an informal discussion today. This will be very different from any of my other presentations. I'm not going to show any equations today. I'm not going to talk about experiments. I'm not going to show any neural data whatsoever. The goal here is more to try to tease you, to try to be provocative, and to try to stimulate the dialogue between, especially between philosophers and neuroscientists. So I've been extremely proud to be part of this group, and I am learning a lot from our discussions. And yet sometimes I found that sometimes I feel that we're talking past each other. So the goal for today is to try to discuss what I call the rules of the game in terms of the agenda, to try to understand the mechanisms of free will. And again, to try to, the goal is not to offend anyone here, but on the contrary, to try to recruit all your talent to enhance our synergistic interactions. Many of you have been thinking about the problem of free will for much longer than I have. Most of you, if not all of you, have been thinking about the problem in a much deeper fashion than I have. So my goal here is to try to learn, and therefore to try to recruit all your talent to be able to come up with better experiments, better theories, better computational models to try to understand the mechanisms of volition. So the objective of the game is to try to figure out the mechanisms underlying volitional decisions. What do I mean by mechanisms? I think that I believe that in order to understand volitional decisions, any explanation needs to be rooted in the fundamental principles of science, and that is ultimately physics. The explanation ultimately also has to be written in the language of science, which I think is ultimately mathematics. So by way of an analogy, we have a pretty sophisticated understanding of the cascade of processes that go from a photon impinging on the retina all the way to action potentials coming out from retinal ganglion cells. My aspiration is to have a similarly detailed mechanistic explanation for volitional decisions. What do I mean by volitional decisions? Well, that's a slightly thornier question. So I want to very quickly illustrate this with a very simple operational definition of a type of tasks, that most of you are pretty familiar and we've been discussing quite a lot. So the type of task that I want you to have in mind while I stipulate the rules of the game today is extremely simple. So here's Michael. I'm going to ask Michael to either raise his right hand or his left hand. He doesn't have any physical impediment. There is no value associated with raising the right hand or the left hand. He can do so whenever he wants. And so that's the entire task. So at some point, Michael decided to raise his right hand. And in a general, in an experiment, we may do this multiple times. So Michael may decide first that he wants to raise his left hand. He may wait for a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, and then raise his left hand again, then the right one, then the left one, and so on. So this is my very, very naive and very simple intuition of what what's in the back of my mind when I talk about volitional decisions. There's no cue here. There is no special reward. We're not forcing Michael to raise one hand or the other. This is sort of the very basic and what I think is the simplest possible way of thinking about volitional decisions. For sure, this does not encompass everything we need to understand and we want to understand about volitional decisions. But I think this is a reasonable, good picture to start in terms of our discussion. So who can participate in this game? Everyone. And I think this is very important. As I said, I think that some of us may speak math or may speak action potentials, but ultimately we really need every single one of your brains here to try to help in this problem. And I think it would be a pity if we cannot really capitalize on all the ideas that that everyone here has. And my goal here is to try to establish a dialogue and try to help in this dialogue to try to design better experiments and better theories and better models of volitional decisions. Who wins? Well, everyone. This is a little bit, when I was preparing these slides yesterday, I showed this to my daughter and she was quite disappointed that there are no winners and losers. Everybody wins if we can understand the mechanisms of volitional decisions. What's at stake here is enormous. Our entire legal system is sort of founded on very ill-defined notions of volition. The clinical implications of understanding volitional decisions are also enormous in terms of the quality of life of people who have deficits that are associated with volitional decisions. With the major advances in AI and machine learning these days, there's an enormous interest in the question of whether we can endow artificial agents with any notion of volition. And ultimately, and perhaps even more important than all the clinical, computational, and legal implications, I think this is one of the most important questions of all time, and we're interested in understanding this at a deep mechanistic level. So I want to start with my first rule, which is that scientific theory should be falsifiable. And this is going back to one of my favorite philosophers, Sir Karl Popper. I was talking with Rosa the other day, and I hope that she will have much more to say about this. There are many problems with the notion of falsifiability. It's not as simple and black and white as it might seem. Sometimes experiments can be noisy. Experiments can be conducted in the wrong way. Experiments can be reinterpreted later in the light of new theoretical advances. But I think it's essential for any theory that we're going to postulate about volitional decisions that it has to be, at least in principle, falsifiable. So let me say right at the beginning that there are lots of exciting ideas and texts out there that are not falsifiable. So here are just a couple of examples. Shakespeare is not falsifiable. The US Constitution is not falsifiable. And if you read papers, you will sooner or later come up with lots of word models and pseudo-scientific constructs out there which are not falsifiable. The fact that these are not falsifiable does not render them any less interesting or less useful or less beautiful. The beauty of Shakespeare and the usefulness of the US Constitution are not denied here. It's just that none of these are scientific theories. And my goal here is to come up with a scientific theory of volition. So I think this is my first rule, rule number one. Any theory has to be falsifiable. If it's not falsifiable, it's just not a scientific theory. Okay, I want to also comment that the fact that hard to falsify is still falsifiable. Just to come up with a completely ridiculous theory, but just to put it out there, let's say that my theory of how Michael decides to raise his right hand has to do with Britney Spears singing a song and 3 blue butterflies flying around the capital of Cameroon. That may sound ridiculous to all of you, but that's a falsifiable theory. It's hard to falsify, but in principle, we could falsify that theory. There are many examples in the history of science of ideas that it took decades, if not centuries, to try to falsify or to lend support to. As far as I know, string theory is still extremely hard to falsify with any current experimental protocol. Ideas about gravitational waves require millions of dollars and decades to try to gather some sort of support. Theories can be hard to falsify because we need a lot of money, a lot of resources, because we don't, because the experiments needed are not, they may not conform to our notions of ethics. Theories may be hard to falsify because we just don't have the right techniques or the right technology. But I will accept any theory that at least in principle could be falsified. Of course, we're all particularly excited about theories that we can try to falsify today with our current techniques today. But if we cannot falsify it today, but at least there's a way to falsify it, I still accept that as a reasonable and plausible theoretical construct. The main problem I have is with theories that are just impossible to falsify because there's absolutely no way that any kind of experimental data could change our minds. Okay, the second point I want to make, and this is my second rule, is an argument against anthropomorphism in neuroscience in particular. I'm always puzzled by attending lots of lectures when somebody says humans are the only species that can do X or that have X, where X can be language or humor or free will. I don't know any evidence for such claims. Humans are the only, to my knowledge, humans are the only animal species that wear Nike shoes. That much I think is pretty true. Everything else, as far as I know, especially in terms of volitional decisions, my first conjecture is that non-human animals are the same as human animals in terms of the basic mechanisms of volitional decisions. Sure, you can argue against this. And again, part of my goal here is to be provocative and hope that it will elicit a lot of reactions and questions and disagreement. I think that's fine. To be quite sure, I think this is a falsifiable conjecture more than a rule. So I put it as a rule with an asterisk here, but it's not an axiom. In principle, I am willing to be convinced that volitional decisions are the exclusive property of human animals. I don't see any evidence for that, and as a working hypothesis, I think there's a lot to gain from experiments in animals, in non-human animals. And therefore, I think it's very important for us to assume, for the moment at least, that non-human animals have the same type of mechanisms for volitional decisions. You can push me here and ask me, well, how about C. elegans worms? How about bacteria? How about flies? How about plants? We can come up with lots of discussions about these. I don't think that those are super fundamental right now, at least in terms of mice and cats and dogs and monkeys and other primates. My initial conjecture here is that there's absolutely no difference in terms of the basic mechanism. So we can study all of these non-human animals and draw major conclusions about the fundamental mechanisms of volitional decisions. So to introduce my third and last rule, I want to read this sentence here. Guided by our beliefs, culture, and moral responsibility, humans have goals that are instantiated into intentions that ultimately lead to will decisions that orchestrate their actions. Worry not, I have not copied and pasted this from any of the writings from any person here. I actually just made this up myself. And the reason I made this up is because I struggle with these kind of sentences. I don't understand anything of what's going on in here. I don't really know what beliefs are, what culture is, what responsibility is, let alone moral responsibility, what goals are and what intentions are. So my third rule is that for the moment, I'd like to remove all of these words from our game and argue that we need operational definitions, that any term that we want to use en route towards understanding the mechanisms of volitional decisions requires an operational definition. Okay, so to try to come up with operational definitions, let me start by just listing some of the things that we can measure. So in terms of behavior, we can measure people or animals pressing a key or a lever. We can measure reaction times. We can measure eye movements. We can measure head positions, facial expressions. In the case of humans in particular, we can also trigger language-based responses. And this is where things may get a little bit tricky because sometimes it's hard to quantify and evaluate language-based responses, as opposed to perhaps more systematic ways in which we can try to measure key presses and reaction time. But I don't want to discard language-based responses. These are real behaviors that, in principle, we can also measure and use them to come up with operational definitions. This is not meant by any means, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of things we can measure. This is just an example of the kind of words that I'd like to allow in our game. These are the kind of things that we can actually measure. So the other set of things that we can measure have to do with physiological variables. And so here I'd like to advance another conjecture, which is that volition is of the brain, by the brain, and for the brain. That is that the main focus of study for us should be neuroscience and the brain. So in principle, at least, I don't have anything against studying the liver, the toe muscles, and the heart. But everything we know right now about volitional decisions seems to indicate that we should be studying the brain. If you have a theory that requires making measurements in the liver, I would be very willing to accept that. I think that would be perfectly fine in terms of building operational definitions. But as a conjecture, I would start by removing all of these. Many of you will note that by removing the heart here, we will be negating at least a couple of thousands of years of lots of eminent people that thought that the heart was critical for different aspects of cognition, including, of course, volitional decisions. But I want to remove all of these and focus on studying the brain. This is a conjecture. This is not a rule. And again, this is falsifiable. So you can prove me wrong and show that we actually really need to study the liver and the heart and so on. So what can we measure in terms of physiology? Well, lots of things. Here's a non-exhaustive list. So outside, because I think the brain is important, I sort of divided our measurements into those that are coming from outside the brain versus inside the brain. So we can measure heart rates, we can measure pressure, temperature, skin conductance, scalp EEG, and things like fMRI. And then inside the brain, we can measure things like action potentials, local field potentials. We can measure calcium signals, neurotransmitters, gene expression. We can measure the connections between different neurons and so on. Again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. This is just an illustration of the type of vocabulary that I think we should use for any kind of operational definition. So I'm going to be especially kind to all of us, and I'm going to allow also to have future measurements. So these are the kind of things that we can measure today. But in principle, there's nothing wrong in coming up with falsifiable theories that require measurements that are not available yet. Of course, they have to be measured. They have to be measurements that are rooted in fundamental physics, right? So, but I'm going to allow future measurement. For example, here's wishful thinking on my side. I would love to be able to record the spiking activity of every single neuron in the human brain for an entire year, plus having detailed connectivity map of every single other neuron, plus the concentration of every extracellular neurotransmitter. Nothing that I'm saying here violates any law of physics. It's just that current techniques do not allow us to do anything even remotely close to any of these. But I think this is a legitimate potential future measurement. So it's okay to come up with theories that require this kind of future type of measurement. So this is still, I think, legal within the rules of the game that I'm trying to stipulate here. So in essence, what I mean by rule 3 is that we need operational definitions, and these operational definitions need to include measurables. So here are again a short list, a non-exhaustive list of things we can measure. So any definition needs to be linked to measuring heart rate, or measuring skin conductance, or measuring action potentials and reaction times and eye movements and so on. So here's one part that I suspect many of you will be scandalized and very upset very quickly when I say that these terms here on this list are not allowed. So I don't want to allow the words beliefs, goals, culture, intentions, moral responsibility, and so on. Just to be clear, this is not an argument against freedom of speech. I am very willing to include all of these words in our vocabulary, as long as we can map them to the kind of things that I have here on the left. We cannot define goals in terms of intentions. We cannot define intentions in terms of desires, and desires in terms of moral responsibility, and so on. So we cannot define words here in terms of other words on this list. But as long as you take any of the words here and we can connect them to any measurable variable, then I think that that's a fair game within the rules of the game that I'm proposing here. So if we want to include the word goals in our explanation of volitional decisions, then we need to define what a goal is in terms of reaction times, in terms of key presses, in terms of action potentials. Okay, and this is, I suspect, one of the aspects that may be particularly shocking, and I hope many of you will disagree and present arguments for why we should use words that are hard to define and can only be defined with non-measurable variables. So I want to conclude here. I want to leave ample time for discussion, because again, the main point here is to stimulate discussions and have people react to this idea. So I want to quickly end up with just trying to bring that back to Michael here. So here's Michael. Recall that all he has to do is either raise his right hand or his left hand. So I'm going to define a volitional decision in an operational way by measuring when he presses one key or the other. So instead of raising one hand here, I'm sort of switching to pressing the right key or pressing a left key on a keyboard or a lever. We can measure the reaction times. This is, I think, pretty straightforward. And just for the sake of argument, I'm going to say that we're going to record action potential from neurons in the supplementary motor area. I don't want to get hung up here in a discussion about whether the supplementary motor area is critical or not. I personally think that it's probably not, although we wrote papers on the supplementary motor area, I think our understanding of the real mechanisms in cortex are still very, very primitive. All I want to do here is to give you a flavor for what an operational definition could look like and what a theory could look like. So I'm defining volitional decisions in terms of things that we can measure. So that's what I mean by volition. We can also introduce another word here that I suspect many of you like, which is agency. So I can also ask Michael, did you intend to press the right key or the left key? So we can measure agency both in terms of key presses or also in terms of action potential. So this is, I think, also an operational definition of these words. So we can include now these words in our vocabulary because they are actually mapped to things that can be measured in the context of these tasks. So here's another thing that I mentioned very briefly at the beginning that I think many of you will will perhaps react against with due reason. And I argue that the language of science is mathematics. So ultimately, I want to be able to come up with explanations of volitional decisions that are rooted in mathematics that can be instantiated in computational models. So I want to present a very quick cartoon idea of how a volitional decision could arise, not because I think that this idea is correct. I personally think that it's not, but just to give you a flavor for what an operational definition is and what the falsifiable theory looks like. So here the idea is that we have a neuron, let's say in the supplementary motor area. We have spikes that are inputs from other neurons in the brain. This neuron is integrating the activity of all of these inputs. They are integrated through a very specific type of very simple model in neuroscience called an integrate and fire circuit. And whenever this neuron fires, that is the voltage reaches a certain threshold, this neuron fires, and that's when Michael decides to raise his right hand. Again, I don't want to especially defend this model. I think that there's lots of things that are completely wrong with this model. I just want to put it out here as an example of a falsifiable theory. So this is a theory that says volition arises when activity in this, the intracellular activity in neurons in the supplementary motor area reaches a certain threshold. Again, we can discuss about why the supplementary motor area. I'm not married to a supplementary motor area. That's not the main point here. The main point is that this theory is falsifiable. You can take, you can do an optogenetics experiment, for example, and silence all the neurons that the model postulates has to be involved in volitional decisions. If Michael can still have a feeling of agency as defined by a key press, if Michael can still raise his right hand in a volitional manner, when you're inactivating these neurons, then we have falsified this theory. This is just one example of many ways in which we can falsify this type of theory. Again, the main purpose here is to just to show how we can make progress with very simple experimental definitions, with operational definitions of every word that we're using, and with theories that can, in principle, be falsified by current experimental techniques. Okay, so here's what I hope will be the homework for many of us for the next months and many years. So how can we operationally define our favorite terms? So again, many of you have been thinking about mechanisms of volitional decisions for a very long time. I'd like to ask you to come up with operational definitions for all of these ideas, so that we can actually convert all of the scholarly work that has been happening in philosophy for millennia and in neuroscience for, let's say, for 1 century. So we can convert all of these ideas into operational definitions and things that we can actually measure in the lab. And at the same time, the second homework for us is to come up with falsifiable theories about volitional decisions. I would rather come up with theories that are wrong and that we can falsify. I think that's progress. I think that falsifying theories and coming up with better theories will lead us to more rapid progress in the field than coming up with texts and ideas that are just impossible to falsify. So that's my main argument that I wanted to put out today for discussion. So to summarize what I said, the rules of the game are simply 3 rules. One is that any theory should be falsifiable. The second one is that non-human animals also make volitional decisions. And the third one is that any definition must be an operational definition. So that's all I wanted to say. So those are what I propose as the basic rules of the game. And now let's play.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel, for this very stimulating argument. And now let's move on to Rosa.
Let me share my screen. Okay, you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay, so we're not playing the game just yet, but I'll try to make this quick so that we can get to the playing of the game. So one of the things I thought about after talking to Gabriel about this was that really there are a bunch of different questions in this area, and it's not that there's a single game that we want to play. So I want to just start by asking, what do we want to know about free will, right? Like, what is the point of this enterprise? And I want to say up front that in thinking about this question, I'm really indebted to things that Daniel Dennett, Adina Roskis, and Peter Godfrey Smith have written. So here are some things we might want to know. What is free will, right? And that's kind of like the explanandum, right? If we don't agree on what it is, then we can't really have a productive conversation about whether we have it or how it works. Only after we pin it down can we ask those questions. And then after we have these questions on the table, we might also ask, what is the role of neuroscience? And I guess I kind of want to ask the audience, which of these three questions are scientific questions? So I think probably we can all agree that the third one is a scientific question, but what about the first two? I know you can't actually respond, but I'm asking you anyway. And I think the first question, right, what is it? Pinning it down is not obviously a scientific question, at least not entirely, and at least not initially. The second one, I think, is more contentious. You might think that once we've pinned down what it is, and we go through this procedure that Gabriel has prescribed for us, that then it becomes a scientific question, right? Once we figure out what the terms mean in neurophysiological terms, then maybe hold that in mind, and I'll come back to that at the end. But if you think about the role of neuroscience, it seems like it can really only address the questions that we do think of as scientific. It, at least in principle, tells us how the brain works. It gives us a causal picture of the mechanism by which behavior is generated. And you want to phrase the question or pose the question in a way that allows science to get a grip. And in this, I completely agree with Gabriel. But before we can get there, we have to settle the earlier question, right? Like, what is the target of our explanation? And you might have different conceptions of what free will is that might make science more or less relevant to answering the question. So, you might think, what is free will? That's a paradigmatically philosophical question. And to get the answer to that, maybe you might want to know what philosophers believe. This is a survey. Usually surveys are not how we resolve intellectual disagreements about whether or not we have free will, for example, or what the right conception of free will is. But this is some interesting information. You might also ask, independent of what philosophers believe, like, what's the right conception of free will to investigate? right? Like what are the considerations that go into determining which concept we think is important to understand? So I think here are two sort of pragmatic considerations that we should take on board. One is that the right conception of free will had better be one that's accessible in principle to our scientific methods, right? At least for the purposes of this project. Because if it's not accessible in principle, like neuroscientists should go home, not going to be able to help us with this. The second consideration that we should bring on board is that the right conception of free will should be responsible to our pre-theoretic commitments. And that might include our other prior scientific commitments. For example, physicalism, or the idea that we're physical beings and that the mental supervenes on the physical, right? If we don't fold that into our conception, then again, it seems like science can't really help us here. And the last one, maybe this one it's so obvious that it doesn't need saying, but we need the right conception to be, we need the conception that we investigate to be one that helps us to make and clarify distinctions that we care about, right? So you could stipulate that free will is just, painting things red. And that just seems like it's doing violence to the notion of free will. It's like so far away from anything that we might consider free will that it's kind of stupid. So we need something that's at least in the vicinity that seems like it's making contact with what we originally cared about. Okay, so I'm not saying that this is the right conception of free will for neuroscience to investigate, but it seems like it's a plausible one. So the compatibilist notion of voluntary decision-making or freedom as making decisions that issue from the right kinds of psychological sources, right? Acting on the basis of our beliefs and values and goals, doing things that are consistent with our plans for ourselves, and so on. And this is a notion of freedom that says that whether or not the world is deterministic is not really relevant. And that seems like a good notion based on the considerations I listed in the previous slide, because we can't tell if the world is deterministic or not. That's not something that's open to scientific investigation. So we might as well look at a notion of free will that doesn't rely on the answer to determinism being one way or the other. Okay, so moving on to the second question, right? Suppose just provisionally that we decide to investigate a compatibilist notion of free will, then we want to know, do we have it? And in order to investigate whether we have it, we have to do as Gabriel says, and try to cash out these psychological terms, beliefs, values, volition, voluntariness, in the taxonomy of neuroscience. And Gabriel's already given us an overview of what the resources, neuroscientific resources are that are available to us for this operationalization. And only once we do this can we ask, how does it work? Okay, so I actually stole a slide from Gabriel from an earlier talk, but here's a bunch of people who had quite different views on free will. And it seems to me that their disagreements were not scientific disagreements in any obvious way. They might also have had scientific disagreements, but the fact that they had different views on whether or not we had free will seemed based on not just scientific disagreements, but conceptual disagreements about what the relevant facts were going to be. And it makes sense that they would have different conceptions of what it was, and that they wouldn't have scientific disagreements because they're from vastly different periods of time with vastly different scientific pictures of the world. But what we want to do if we actually want to perform this operationalization that maps our beliefs and values and goals, these psychological terms, to neuroscientific things that we can measure, is a kind of aligning of the manifest and the scientific images. So this is a really nice illustration from Paul Churchland in Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind, But the idea that I want to illustrate here is actually from Sellers, who in Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man describes at least two ways that the world presents itself. So on the left, you have this sort of cartoon of the manifest image. So the world as it seems to us as we go about our everyday lives. And the manifest image is supposed to be the world of, everyday objects, things that we can see with the naked eye, people, and then also these mental things like thoughts, plans, intentions, things that we experience and that we can interrogate introspectively. And Sellers contrasts this with the scientific image, and the cartoon for that is on the right, which is a picture of the world that's built up through scientific investigation. And in this case, it's a picture of the solar system. And science postulates imperceptible things for the purpose of explaining the perceptible. So it's telling us like the underlying mechanism behind our everyday conception of the world. And you might think that the problem of neuroscience is an explanatory enterprise more generally, not just in the question of free will, as an explanatory enterprise for understanding the mind is something like figuring out how the two images relate to each other in the domain of the psychological and the mental, in explaining human behavior and experience. And so what neuroscience requires us to do, and what the explanatory enterprise requires us to do is to align these images, right? Is to figure out how to put them in registration with each other. How to see both the fact that the sun seems to be rising and setting in the sky and the fact that we're orbiting around the sun. Seems like it ought to be possible to see these things at once and see how it is that they can both be true. And this is, in some sense, a philosophical project, maybe the philosophical project, but it's also one that scientists engage in all the time, every day, in order to even formulate experiments that address questions that come up in ordinary life. Okay, so I think that's kind of the game, and then the question is, how do we perform this alignment, right? What are the constraints on this alignment? And here's Gabriel's sentence again. And I think the right way to think about this is to think of free will and folk psychology as a model, right? In the same way that we have other scientific models, but it's a model in the taxonomy of the manifest image. So the taxonomy of the manifest image includes things like beliefs and culture and moral responsibility and goals and intentions. And we need to figure out how to align that with the things that we can measure. I think that that's an instance of this more general question of within science of how do we make models responsible to empirical evidence at all? And I think people have strong feelings about this, but they don't all agree about it, right? So you might ask, like, how do we decide if you have a theoretical neuroscientific model, if you have a computational model, how do you decide whether what we see in the brain supports what that model says? How do we fit that model to what we can actually measure, right? How do we test whether there's dendritic computation or what those computations are? Or how do we test whether there is predictive processing in various parts of the brain? How do we tell whether our brains are Bayesian or not, right? We can write down a mathematical model of what's going on, but then there's this question of what do we then go look for in the brain to see whether that model is right? And what would we have to find in the brain to be convinced that the model is wrong? Okay, so here's one example of a theoretical, highly mathematical model of what's in the brain. Maybe you might recognize it. This is from an early paper by Friston about the free energy conception. And I maintain that this is a bad way of making models responsible to empirical evidence, right? It's not terribly specific. It's not at all clear what the entities are that you should be looking at or what they should be doing in biological terms, in measurable terms. Here's a better example, right? So the canonical neural computation normalization, it seems like there's a pretty clear mapping from the mathematical or computational entities and processes described, and things that we really can measure, things like firing, right? Figuring out which cells are firing when and how they're connected to each other. So this is a kind of model that we can hold accountable to empirical evidence. Then there are things that are, less clear, right? So if you have models of Bayesian inference that are supposed to explain our behavioral responses, it's much harder to see how you would map that to brain processes of the kind that Gabriel was describing, right? Maybe we could measure the activity of every neuron at whatever time scale we want, and it seems like it would still be open, right? What the right level of description would be to try to find something like a Bayesian inference process. Here's another familiar model that's been talked about a lot recently, right? If you have deep neural network models of the brain, how do you map those to things that we can actually measure in terms of physiology? I think there are lots of suggestions, and I think maybe the clearest kinds of mappings depend on things that are not controversial. Maybe the kinds of commitments that Gabriel described, where we say, look, a good way to describe a neuron is in terms of an integrate and fire kind of entity, something that takes a bunch of inputs, adds them up, performs some kind of thresholding or nonlinear operation on them, and produces an output. And like, that's a way that we can perform this kind of mapping. So then you ask, like, what are the constraints on the mapping for psychological terms? And I think we might be able to look for inspiration at these mappings that we have to do all the time already in order to put the language of math into a form that allows us into a form that can be tested by looking at the brain. So maybe the constraints on the mapping for faux psychological terms should be the same as the ones for other models, such as computational ones. And I think if this analogy is right, then saying that the language of science is math doesn't yet help us with the problem, right? Because we can come up with a model in mathematical language, and then we still have to figure out what the right mapping is. So maybe we have the manifest image, right, the neurophysiological image, and then the computational image, and we have to figure out how to bring all of these into registration with each other. And I think once you say that, it seems like there isn't going to be a single registration that will satisfy all of our desires, that will do all of the things that we want it to do. So you might want different models for different purposes. You might not always want the same operationalization for a term like goal, for example. But you still want something that's accessible in principle to our scientific methods, and one that's responsible to our theoretical commitments. Okay, so do we have free will? I think that it can sort of summarize all of these considerations together and into this description of what we're trying to do in this domain into 4 projects. And these are described by Peter Godfrey Smith in 2010 paper, Metaphysics and the Philosophical Imagination. So the idea is the first project, the initial project, is just figuring out what it is that we care about, right? When we debate the question of free will passionately, whether in a philosophical context or in an everyday context, like, we want to know why we care about it. And so, different people say different things. It has to do with our notions of moral responsibility. It has to do with how predictable behavior is. It has to do with what the appropriate reactive attitudes are towards other people. So gather all that up and then try to regiment it in a way that makes it precise enough and consistent and coherent enough that you can then try to map it onto the world as we understand it in naturalistic or scientific terms, right? So then there's a second project, which you might think of as the project of science, which is figure out, what does the brain do during decision making? Like, when did things happen? Where did they happen? What are the causal relationships between those events? And what are the relationships between those events and our introspective experiences and self-reports, right? That's like the scientific image once we've focused our investigative lens onto the right part of the world. And then I think the project that that Mr. Free Will and this enterprise is engaged in is project 3, right? Like, how are 1 and 2 related, and are they related at all? And it might turn out that they're not related, right? So if incompatibilists are right, it might turn out that describing what the brain does during decision making just isn't relevant to the relevant notion of free will, which requires us to have been able to do otherwise. Or it might turn out that if you're not a physicalist and you think that you know, all of these psychological or mental events having to do with volition don't have anything to do with the brain, that again, like, there's no contact here. But if you're an ordinary neuroscientist, I think for the most part, you think there is some systematic relationship between the things that people's brains do and what we describe them as doing in folk psychological terms. And then the question is what the best way to bring them into registration is. And then the last project is something like the possibility of reforming our concepts, right? Reforming how we think and talk, changing our patterns of use. Like, maybe we could find out something about the brain and how decision-making actually works that would make us think, okay, maybe folk psychology is wrong and we don't mostly make decisions on the basis of our beliefs and desires and goals. Really, when we try to pin down what our goals are, we see that they're almost never consistent with what we actually do. Seems like, in principle, empirically, we could discover that, although I think it's probably pretty unlikely. Or you might think that you have to give up on the idea of free will if it turns out that that all of our explanations of what we did are always confabulations. I think it's hard to end up saying things like that because the kinds of mappings that we make aren't themselves the kinds of things that are falsifiable, but they're stipulative. So when we say, I'm going to define voluntary decision making as, you know, pick your favorite operationalization here, that itself is not a scientific claim that could turn out to be false. That's just something that you're stipulating. That doesn't mean that the stipulation isn't going to be ultimately affected by how the world is, because what we find useful to stipulate and what we want to stipulate as reasonable creatures who want to do good science is ultimately shaped by how the world is, indirectly, and shaped by how well a particular mapping seems to capture our intuitions. But taken in isolation at a moment, the mappings themselves are not like empirical hypotheses. And we're also not guaranteed a single correct mapping from things like goals and intentions and beliefs and desires to things in the brain, right? It might turn out that our concept of voluntary or volitional action doesn't pick out a physically unified phenomenon in the world. I think that's actually probably pretty likely if you compare other folk psychological terms that we have revised, things like memory and attention, where it seems like there are lots of different processes going on there. And we've sort of tried to, and actually after learning more about the science, we've allowed those differences to filter into our everyday vocabulary. So now, now we are willing to talk about, you know, knowing that versus knowing how, or you know, working memory versus procedural memory versus semantic memory. Like those are things that we discovered through scientific investigation that we then incorporated into our everyday conception of how memory works. And it might turn out that, probably will turn out that free will is also like that. There are lots of different things going on that fall under that umbrella term. And then the last thought here is that operationalizations, not only are they not immediately falsifiable, but they're also the kinds of things that come in packages, right? So you don't just decide to operationalize one term, but you decide to operationalize a whole bunch of things together. And it might turn out that if that operationalization isn't one that you like, or that it seems like on that operationalization, it turns out that we don't have free will, that you then want to change multiple things. And so it might turn out that different packages are all compatible with the available empirical evidence. And then the decision about which set of operationalizations you want to pick is going to depend on pragmatic considerations and not purely empirical ones. So just to sum up, there are different questions that we might want to ask, right? We want to know what it is, but that means we need to figure out what we're investigating. We want to know whether we have it. That means we need to specify a mapping. And I'm suggesting that we should look for inspiration when thinking about what mappings should be allowed and what the rules of the mapping are. We should look to the general constraints of how to test theoretical models with evidence, how we map theoretical models to things that we can measure. And then how does it work? Well, then we just do normal science on the parts of the brain that are specified by the mapping. And then we might revise the mapping depending on what we find empirically. And here I want to go back to the thing I mentioned earlier, like, is this second question really an empirical question? Is it really a scientific question after you specify the mapping? Well, it might turn out that there are some mappings that we are unwilling to accept, right? So it might be that you pick some perfectly plausible mapping from voluntary decision-making to things that happen in the brain, and you discover that on that mapping, we don't ever make voluntary decisions. On that mapping, we never exercise our will. And then there are sort of two ways you can go here, right? You can say, okay, it turns out we've discovered that we don't have free will on this conception of free will. Or you might think, no, we definitely have free will. This must not have been a good conception to adopt in the first place. And if you kept doing that, whatever the evidence was, then you might think, actually, it turns out that whether or not we have free will wasn't something that was open to scientific investigation at all. That's something that we are committed to in the same way that we might be committed to the idea that, you know, humans think, right? Like, that's our fixed point. That's our explanandum. And then our job is to find the right mapping that will allow us to understand how it is that we think. And we won't allow any mappings that make it the case that humans don't think at all, or that humans don't have free will at all, right? That's a possible outcome. I guess it's a possible sociological outcome based on what we find ourselves doing as scientists. So I think if we want to talk about whether we have free will, you have to decide which project you want to take priority, right? Do you want the priority, do you want figuring out how, do you want the mapping to take priority, where you stipulate what it is that you care about, where you operationalize what you care about, and then just do science on that, and then maybe you can have lots of different projects, each investigating a different notion of free will? Do you allow that to take priority, or do you instead make finding the best match, where best is evaluated subject to the usual ways of evaluating how good a theory is? Do you want finding the best match to take priority, and not, you know, whether or not we actually end up having free will on that mapping? Okay, I think I'm out of time, so that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosa. That was thought-provoking. And we already have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I don't see anyone who's raised his, oh, now someone has raised his hand as well. Let's start with Mark's question. Mark, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. So this is a question for Gabriel, and that is, what is the difference, if any, between a human and a robot when they're doing the same thing? like in the experiment you were describing, one could in fact record every little element of the way that it's being done, would that what would be the difference in that circumstance? Would you then say that after you have recorded all the different aspects of the robot behavior, that you would understand where the robot is exerting will in this particular situation? And similarly, even if you could record every single neuron in the human brain for a year, how would that help you in interpreting where free will was?
Well, let me start with the second question. The answer is I have no idea. I was postulating that as a just to illustrate that I will allow future measurements to be part of operational definitions. I'm perfectly willing to accept theories and operational definitions that require measurements that we don't have. That's the only point I was trying to say. I think even if we had this kind of measurement, I think we still need to have smart people like all of you guys define the right experiments. And I think this would be extremely useful, but I don't know that would answer the question in and of itself. I do think that if we could have access to the activity of every single neuron, we could potentially trace the path from the, and potentially even get to the root of which are the first type of circuits that give rise to a volitional decision. But I think I don't know the answer to a second question. The first question will have a similar answer. I don't know the answer to the first question either. Ultimately, my belief is that we will be able to endow machines with intentions and agency in the same way that humans do. I don't see any physical limit to volition. There's nothing special about human volition. I think that dogs have volition too, and I think robots will ultimately also have volition. Right now, I'm very skeptical that my iPhone or my computer have volition, but that's not to say that future circuits. What exactly is missing in my computer? Why do I believe that my computer does not have volition? I'm not sure. I think right now we don't have machines that can stipulate, yes, this particular action was volitional, this one was not. But I don't see any impediment in principle, at least, to building machines that have the same type of volitional actions that we do. So great questions, very bad answers. I'm sorry.
Well, it's fine.
Okay, so we have another question by Ned.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I think as with many aspects of having to do with the mind, it is useful to look for analogies in the study of perception, which I think is the most advanced part of psychology and neuroscience. And what we see in the study of perception, in my view, is no operational definitions ever. What we instead get are precisifications of ordinary terms. So that's how we connect the manifest and the scientific image. So, for example, take the term attention. What we've done is we have precisified it into endogenous attention, exogenous attention, spatial attention, feature-based attention, object-based attention, and we have ways of measuring these things. You know, Marissa Carrasco's experimental program has involved a number of ways of manipulating attention to show the effects of attention on perception. And as part of that enterprise, we can look at the mechanisms, the neural mechanisms of attention. So, for example, Carrasco has shown that one of the mechanisms of spatial attention is that receptive fields are narrowed, or the receptive field of a neuron will move over to invade what was just the receptive field of another neuron. And you know, these things so these can all be described without any operational definition. There are disagreements about what these experiments are measuring. Rosa mentioned the case of memory. We distinguish between a number of different kinds of memory that weren't in ordinary thinking, episodic memory, procedural memory, declarative memory, but also within declarative memory, working memory, long-term memory, fragile visual short-term memory, iconic memory. So what we typically, I think, in the places where we've really made progress in connecting the manifest image with the scientific image, what we've basically done is made a lot of personifications of the ordinary terms. The terms, when we have a term that seems to correspond to things in our mind that we can measure and do experiments on, like memory or attention, we've succeeded in this way. So I think, I think this roughly fits the Godfrey Smith model that Rosa was talking about. Yeah, anyway, there it is.
Okay, thank you. Now Eddie would
no
like.
No, so
Oh.
quickly.
Got a question?
I thought Rosa may want to say something, but very quickly, I think I agree with what Ned's saying here.
It's a complete disagreement with all the stuff you said about operational definition. There are no operational definitions. Are a terrible idea.
Okay.
To succeeding, nobody makes an operational definition.
I think everything you said are operational definitions. I think we have operational definitions.
So there are ways of measuring. The places where operational definitions run wild are where there's no science, like in IQ, for example. IQ, what's an IQ test? Oh, it's what's intelligence? It's what an IQ test measures. It's when you don't have science, you make operational definitions.
I disagree strongly. I think every single word that he used, spatial attention and different forms of memory, each one of those is linked to particular experiments and operational definitions. That's why we made progress. We made progress in the study of attention and memory because we were able to make finer refinements of the vocabulary that we use, each one of which is linked to particular experiments and particular measurements. That's what pushed the field forward in terms of memory and in terms of attention. And I hope that we can all jointly do the same thing in terms of volition. If we don't like the word operational definition, we can dance around that. The main thing is that we have experiments that can measure what we mean by spatial attention. So now, if I talk to another scientist in China, in Japan, in Australia about spatial attention, we can come up with a specific experiment. We put a fixation point. We ask people to do a detection task on the right or on the left, and we're all talking about the same thing. That's what we mean by spatial attention. Furthermore, we can measure the response of neurons doing that. Why? Because we have this operational definition of spatial attention linked to a particular experiment that can be then traced back to neuroscience. 100 years ago, people talked about attention and they had no clue what they were talking about because there was no operational definition. So I think the operational definition is exactly what helped us make progress in attention and memory. I hope we'll do the same thing with volition.
So here's the difference between operational definition and way of measuring. The difference is you make an operational definition, you've stipulated something. Way of measuring, somebody can complain. No, I think that way you are trying to measure attention and it's not working right. You need to do something slightly different. You can't disagree with an operational definition. You just change the subject. So operational definitions are bad. Ways of measuring, scientific ways of measuring are good. And you can argue about whether some way of measuring is better than others or whether, I remember once reading in a sociology article that the person decided to adopt the operational definition of quality of a scientific paper as the number of citations to it. You can't disagree with it. So if the person had instead said, well, it's a terrible problem. We don't know how to measure the quality of a scientific paper, but we'll do our best we can. We'll try with this technique of counting citations. And then you could disagree. You could say, I could propose a more refined way to do it. But once you say operational definition, you've just stipulated, this is what I'm talking about.
I think you're saying that there are bad operational definitions, and I agree with that. And I think even that would be progress. If we figure out that our operational definitions are bad, that means that we need to refine them and make better ones. So are operational definitions the final answer? Definitely not. I agree with you. Are there bad operational definitions? Yes. Without an operational definition, without linking to something concrete, I'm afraid that we can spin our discussions for the next 5 centuries without ever making progress. So I would rather have bad operational definitions, decide that they're bad, and move on to come up with better ones than sort of playing word games that we cannot make progress on. That's
okay. So I'm glad Gabriel's attempt at provocation is proving successful. I'd like to also let other people ask a question. So Eddie was waiting to talk. I'm allowing you to talk now.
Oh, good. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Good to see y'all. I just wanted to pick up on kind of a final point that Rosa was making and connect it to some literature that I think would be helpful for this group. Oshin Deary and some other people have been talking about understanding free will as a sort of natural kind term, not anything as essential as H2O, but the homeostatic kind that philosophers of biology like to talk about, where you begin with sort of understanding what purpose or function a concept like free will plays. And presumably for us, it plays a concept in making differentiations between free and unfree actions. And we have sort of paradigm cases of both. And we probably evolved in order to understand free actions as those that are particularly intelligent, tied to future-oriented behavior, and that we can hold people responsible for in moral contexts. But our concept is not precise at all, and it may not map onto anything exactly in the world that's precise or operationalizable, if you want to use that term. But once we do the science, we might discover that there are some underlying, let's say, you know, in the case of the brain, some underlying neural circuitry or some sort of set of natural conditions that we could pick out as the homeostatic cluster, the cluster of properties that give these functional terms a sort of order that maps roughly onto our functional concepts, but is the real thing in the world that we're picking out and will need to be refined as the Godfrey Smith model suggested. So I think that literature is helpful in this area. And I would also suggest, as Oshin Deary does, that it probably means that there's no way we're gonna find out there's no free will. It's highly unlikely we're gonna find that there's not something in the world and in the brain, presumably, that gets us enough of what our concepts are picking out when we're trying to distinguish free and unfree actions. So I just wanted to put that out there for y'all and hope it helps a little bit.
Okay. So I think Liad has a question.
Yeah, so I have a small clarification question to Rosa, which I think actually might have also been related to what Eddie has asked. So it seemed to me like one of the criteria you were suggesting to examine if a model is good or bad was the way it could be related to neural mechanisms. And my question is, could there be a good model that only relies on cognitive structures? And we still don't know, and that I think might relate to what Eddie said, we still don't know what the neural mechanisms are behind this, but it is still, you know, strong enough to predict our behavior, and it assumes some theoretical constructs, you know, like classical cognitive science, cognitive psychology that has nothing to do with neuroscience. Wouldn't that be still a good model? So that's one question of clarification. And for Gabriel, by the way, I forgot to say that both talks were fantastic and highly stimulating. So thank you both. For Gabriel, I wondered if your project or the game that you're trying to define is how to transition from philosophy to science in general with respect to free will, or how do we distinguish between good scientific theories and bad scientific theories? Because if this is the former, then yes, we need operational definitions. But if it's the latter, then I think the question is not if an experiment or a theory has a theoretical, an operational definition, because it must have. So the way I was taught about, in Psychology 101 about theoretical versus operational definitions, I define theoretically the term or the construct that I want to study, and I define operationally how I either manipulate or measure it. So it seems that, for example, the way I define an operational definition might be a bit different than what Ned defines it. But I think it's closer to what you were defining, Gabriel. So my question, to make a long story short, is shouldn't you revise Rule 3 to say we can only use terms for which we have a good operational definition rather than a operational definition? Because every experiment must have some operational definition, otherwise it cannot measure whatever it sets to measure. So these are my two questions.
I guess I'll go first. I have a quick answer. I don't think that the only good theoretical models of human behavior are those that bottom out in neural mechanisms, because it seems like there are different levels of description, and we want them for different things. But they should be empirically responsible, right? They should be responsible to behavior. They should be responsible to behavior in a wide range of situations where we change the values of the internal variables that are posited in those theories. But I don't think we have to be completely proprietary and say it doesn't count as a good theory of behavior if we can't see it in the neurons. On the other hand, it's definitely not a neuroscientific hypothesis. Right? It's not something that's testable by neuroscience. And so if the only theories that we had of free will were of that form, then it would be ruling out neuroscience as being able to make any contribution to the enterprise.
Thank you.
So,
Okay, and no, sorry, yeah.
But I just want to add, so yes, I agree with what Rosa said and Dad's question. I like neuroscience. I like to study what happens in the side of the brain, but I'm perfectly fine with a theory, or to begin with, at least a theory that can account for purely behavioral aspects. Again, if it's falsifiable and it can be linked to, we can measure reaction times, we can measure key presses, and that's perfectly legitimate to me. And to me, I wouldn't be completely satisfied because I want to know, but what happens inside the brain. But I think ultimately that's a very good first step, I would say, and that's perfectly fine with me. So with respect to the second question, I was mostly reacting against definitions that have absolutely no experimental counterpart whatsoever. So I think we're generally in agreement about they're bad operational definitions, they're bad experiments, so I think I agree with most of what he said. I was mostly reacting about there are certain dogmatic, I mean, we've seen this in many of the questions here and also in the chat. There are certain dogmatic answers like we will never understand free will, or it's impossible. And those are I would put those in the category of Shakespeare and the US Constitution, and they're perfectly fine. And there may be useful answers, there may be beautiful answers. It's just not what I'm seeking. I'm looking here for some scientific theory. So
but I just think that maybe so for example in the case you gave of Michael and the operation definition you suggested, then someone could say, why is this an operational definition of volition rather than of movement? So I think that the most important test is, does this theory or experiment operationalize the theoretical construct well enough for us to consider it a theory of volition rather than of anything else? I think that's the challenge.
I agree. In that sense, again, I applaud what Rosa said, and I think what Ned was saying was also connected to these. I think we'll have to refine our vocabulary, and maybe we'll realize that the Michael test is not really what we ultimately mean, and we'll have to subdivide volition into 25 different things. We'll have a spatial volition and procedural. I don't know. We'll have a whole dictionary of different forms of volition, each one of which will be tied to an experiment that exemplifies what we mean and relevant measurements. But we need to start somewhere. I like Michael because that's to me the simplest possible way to get started. Does that include every single aspect of what we ultimately want to understand? Definitely not. I think there's much more to the story than Michael's raising right hand or left hand, but I do like that as a starting point.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question from Tim Hicks. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask? Wait, let me do that for you.
So maybe Tim is not here. I can say about the gut-brain connections and the vagal system. I'm perfectly okay with that. So if you have a theory of volition that requires investigating the gut, I'm skeptical that the gut has much of an involvement in volition, but I'm perfectly fine if there's a falsifiable theory that requires measuring activity in the gut. That's great. My first reaction is that that we don't need to. There's no such thing as a gut reaction. That everything is really happening in the brain. I'm a cortex chauvinist in many ways, but ultimately, if your theory requires studying the gut, I would call that a falsifiable theory and a perfectly legitimate way of proceeding according to the rules of the game that I stipulated.
Okay. I also see Electra has her hand up.
Sorry, can you hear me now? I wasn't, I don't know if you can hear me, but Gabriel, thanks for that. And that makes sense. I think it is falsifiable. But to my second question, there's not been one mention of, in the definition of volition, the involvement of what we call the self, whatever that means. And doesn't there need to be some discussion of that definition to have some theory about the nature of the self as it involves volition as we try and define volition?
That seems to be way above my pay grade. I think Rosa will answer that because she's way smarter than me. By the way, I don't know who's raising his right hand or left hand with Zoom. That's one of the bugs in Zoom. I don't know what the self is. I would want this, an operational definition of the self. Rosa, what
exactly? Well, exactly. That's my point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that this is actually like one of the key moving pieces where, depending on what you choose to draw the boundaries, how you choose to draw the boundaries around the self, you might be able to look at the very same empirical evidence and say, oh, this is evidence for free will, or oh, this is evidence against it, right? Like if you think about the Libet experiments or any of these experiments that purport to show that decisions happen before we become, quote, aware of them, if you just move the boundaries of the self to that earlier place where the causally important thing is happening and say, oh, that was actually the self and this other thing is epiphenomenal, then you get to say there's free will. Whereas if you move the boundaries away from that, you say, oh, there wasn't free will, the self wasn't responsible, it was, you know, my brain working without me. So I think you have to, that's like the key decision that gives you one answer or another, but I don't know what I don't know that there's a quick way of formulating the constraints on how you should draw those boundaries. It seems like it depends on all your other commitments and how to best satisfy as many of those as possible.
I do think that that particular question is important, and I would phrase it in a slightly different way. If you say, do I have free will or do you have free will? The question is, how do you define I or you?
Exactly.
And that's the same thing as what you're saying, Tim, I guess. But I think you have to define that as an important feature of that question.
Yes, and I think there's promise in being able to scientifically define the self rather than just what's manifest. What appears to be is not, as has been pointed out, is not what is. And our ideas of the self have been mistaken based on our phenomenological experience, but not on the science. And I think we will get to science that defines what I call the self-sensation is and what part it plays in the equation of behavior. So it's not a question of free will or not free will. It's a question of what produces the outcome of behavior in the organism, with the self-sensation playing a greater or lesser part in that equation depending on the circumstance. Because the self-experience has a function, but not the function that we've always thought it to be as the, you know, the absolute agent and independent agent, which I think is a, you know, a flawed conception.
I mean, it sounds like what you just said is a folk psychological conception of the self. I guess I really want to understand what you think the scientific contribution to the definition is. Like maybe science gives us the raw materials that we're allowed to build a conception of the self out of, but how do you decide which of those raw materials to use? Do you
Well,
just say whatever caused behavior, that was the self?
I don't think we're far enough in the neuroscience, in our understanding of how the brain works, to understand beyond, a theoretical conceptual framework, but the actual empirical understanding of the self-sensation in the human organism and what part it plays and what it is. We're not far enough along to really answer that question.
I guess I'm kind of with Gabriel here. Like, what is self-sensation? I have no idea what that means.
I'm writing a book on that now.
I would again define it in a slightly different way. That is, in fact, consciousness. The self-sensation is what you are conscious of, in my mind, anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a big subject, more than we can talk about now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, consciousness is beyond us.
Well,
it's beyond Gabriel, it's beyond me. I don't know.
I think, if I might just jump in, I think it's possible to have a very coherent and useful definition of something like the self that ultimately has no neural correlate, that ultimately can't be operationalized in any clear way. So, for example, Dennett's idea of the self as a narrative center of gravity, that's a useful and a clear conceptual idea of what the self is. You're not going to find any neural correlate for that. You're not going to be able to operationalize that in neural terms.
Yeah, I would disagree with that, because ultimately we're talking about experience, perceptual, and we're talking about the experience of an organism that has to be based on the body if we're being materialistic, and the body functions in a certain way. And so I think there is neural, by definition, neural correlates. We just don't understand those correlates yet.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that Patrick may have had a question before I might have missed. Would you like to ask it?
Well, thank you. I suspect it's more than a comment than a question, and it's really based on something that I heard in both of these really excellent talks. And I want to frame my comment in historical context. So if you look at psychology, it's a relatively new science. It emerged from the sort of conjunction of physiology and philosophy in the 19th century. And a really important metaphysical question is, what are you actually trying to explain? What's the ontology? And there's never been a systematic approach to the ontology of psychology. So people think that psychology is about mental states, but where do we get our ontology of what mental states are there, which we then need to write psychology textbooks about? And it's quite interesting if you look at William James, for example, and all of the German effective sort of empirical psychologists who derived from Kant before him. The ontology always comes from subjective experience. So the ontology of psychology is coming from one's own phenomenal experience, stuff that happens to one. And that just raises this very interesting problem that the cognitive processes or mental states that we're trying to produce theories of might operationalize fairly successfully on the basis of our experience and the behaviors that we find ourselves doing, like attention, for example, which I think one can operationalize fairly clearly from things like the cocktail party effect. But on the other hand, there are lots of aspects of phenomenology which seem pretty shaky, and I think free will is one of them. There is a sense in which it might be an illusion. I'm not saying that it is an illusion, but lots of people have claimed that it is. And I think there's a big original problem really in psychology, which is it doesn't have a correct route to get its ontologies. It's got a slightly mixed origin, and I think this really causes a problem. So our operational definitions and our attempts to actually study things are already based on some ontological presupposition of what things there are that we're trying to study. And psychology faces this big challenge of whether the things that it's trying to study really exist or not. And there are a number of examples in the history of psychology of things that people spent lots and lots of time studying, and 20 years later the fads had moved on and those things didn't really exist anymore. It's a problem. I don't have a solution to that. I think there are some interesting approaches where you try to work out what are your ontological principles. What do you need? What evidence do you need before you say that this mental state exists, or this process exists, or that cognitive process is not one we have need of? And just to give one example, there was some interesting work in the 1990s which attempted to understand the whole of the frontal lobes and what the frontal lobes do, and managed to do so without the need of a concept of inhibition. So all the psychology textbooks say that, oh, the key thing that the frontal lobes do is inhibition. And there was a rather good research program which showed that you could use a different ontology, a different set of concepts to explain all the data. So I just like to say that in psychology, we need metaphysics and we need ontologists.
So as always, just as things get interesting, we have to stop. The thing, of course, is that even if we had this go on for another hour, it would be just as things are getting even more interesting, we would have to stop. That's maybe the nature of the beast here. But I guess this is, again, our last meeting for 2020. I think many of us will be happy to leave this year behind. But we will come back in 2021 with more of these joint seminars. I would like to thank the 5 participants of the 5, or the speakers of the 5 seminars that we've had, and our somewhat, I should say, some very committed audience members that we've had. So just thank you, everyone, and see you in a better 2021, I hope, and take it from there.